Hi everyone, my name is Gillian.
I'm Julia.
I'm Sarah F.
I'm Sarah Grace.
I'm Johnny.
I'm Joanna.
Thank you so much for joining us today to discuss the topic of healthcare in Canada in regards to abortion, euthanasia, and assisted suicide. So every summer, to wrap up the internship, the CLC interns typically run an end of summer fundraiser. But due to COVID restrictions, an online webinar was delivered last summer by the interns, and that's what we're doing again this summer. And since there are 12 of us interns, we have broken ourselves into two groups to deliver two webinars on different topics. So if you have not done so yet, please sign up for the second webinar titled Living But Not Learning, Repeating Human Rights Injustices. We'll leave the sign up form in the chat and it'll take place on Friday, August 27th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. So please join us for that one as well. The idea for today's webinar came from the realization of our group members that healthcare, which is rooted in protecting the sanctity of life, does the exact opposite through such practices that take the lives of the most vulnerable, hence our title. A broken oath refers to the Hippocratic Oath, which some healthcare providers do not maintain, and neglecting the most vulnerable refers to those most in need of our care, such as the preborn, the elderly, and the disabled, which happen to be the main targets of abortion and euthanasia. So without further ado, let's dive into this topic. Julia, the creator of our beautiful logo here on the slide, she is taking care of making sure our tech runs smoothly, and she will be monitoring the chat throughout the presentation. So if you have any questions, please put them in the chat to be answered at the end. Thank you.
All right, so first we're going to look at the Hippocratic Oath. I'm sure many of you have heard about it before, but the Hippocratic Oath is one of the oldest documents in history, and it is still held in high regard by many physicians today. It is a code of ethics written by Hippocrates in the 5th century BC. It lists various obligations that a physician has to his or her patients, beginning with do no harm. It is a pledge to use only the necessary medical treatment and to act in the patient's best interests, while upholding the dignity of the self and of the patient. In particular, I want to point out the second paragraph on this slide. It reads, "I will not give a lethal drug to anyone if I am asked, nor will I advise such a plan. And similarly, I will not give a woman a pessary to case an abortion."
So that passage kind of jumps out at us because what it describes is familiar, right? So it mentions explicitly abortion and euthanasia, which even in Hippocrates' time, the outcome of these actions was clear, and the outcome being the loss of human life. So they're specifically shown to be immoral acts for a physician to engage in, because if the job of a physician is to heal or to at least do no harm, those actions cannot really be considered acceptable.
So today, what are the modern versions of the Hippocratic Oath? There are many versions, actually. These modified versions are typically taken at the convocation ceremony, which is graduation, the white coat ceremony, or both. Some universities have their own versions, some medical school graduates make their own oaths, and some do not take an oath at all. Interestingly enough, most modern versions still cite the do no harm principle. However, they omit the section of the original oath prohibiting abortion and euthanasia. And this speaks to one of the deceptions in our modern healthcare, that these practices worsen health rather than better it. So what is not within the role of healthcare professionals? First, it is not within the role and duty of a healthcare professional to determine when life is no longer worth living and who is worthy of certain medical care and certain medical rights. It is not within the duty of a healthcare professional to cure a patient at the direct, intentional expense of another. Modern medicine has made new ways of recovery possible. Many therapeutic methods are possible with ethical processes, and others are possible due to the detriment of some other patients and vulnerable populations, such as the unethical means of harvesting tissues, fetal cells, organs, and more for the benefit of another population of patients. To rephrase, there are some potentially beneficial therapies that exist because there was harm done to others. The ends never justify the means, especially in such a scenario. Lastly, it is not within the duty of a healthcare professional to administer unnecessary medical treatment to the patient. As it will be explored later on in this presentation, it is a common practice for modern medicine to simply alleviate suffering and symptoms rather than curing the actual illness. This is known as a Band-Aid treatment.
All right, so with that principle of healthcare in mind, it might be worthwhile to look at the man known as the father of healthcare in Canada, which is Tommy Douglas. So as many of you probably know, Douglas was the main force in providing universal healthcare in Saskatchewan, and that became very influential to the federal government. So in 1966, under Prime Minister Lester B. Pearson, universal healthcare would be implemented with 50% of the costs handled by the federal government and the other 50% handled by the remaining provincial governments. And so this program was actually inspired by what Douglas did with universal healthcare in Saskatchewan. But an interesting thing is that it appears the do no harm principle from the Hippocratic Oath was not really important to his view of medicine, because a shocking thing to learn is that he was a eugenicist. So he wrote his master's thesis entitled The Problems of the Subnormal Family, and he proposed solutions in quotes, including segregation, strict marriage laws, and widely distributed birth control, which we'll hear a bit about later, and even sterilization for what he defined as subnormal families. And by that, he meant people deficient in mental or physical health or moral character, by which he was referring to promiscuity. So eugenic views used to be more popular and common among people, but they sort of went out of fashion, so to speak, following World War II and Nazi Germany. So at that point, Douglas would not really be seen advocating for any sort of eugenics. And his views of eugenics were never as extreme as a sort practiced in Nazi Germany. Another important thing is I don't think his views implicate our healthcare system in being inherently eugenicist. But the reason I think it's important to draw attention to them is because it shows what his guiding philosophy of healthcare was, or at least what it wasn't. So in his thesis, he clearly outlines that his eugenic methods are acceptable to prevent problems for the rest of society. And one such problem that he outlines is that of health, noting that the morally subnormal families, as he defines them, spread STDs amongst themselves and to others. And the other problems he outlines are those of financial cost and the burden on progress to others. So I'm just going to read here a little bit, some excerpts from his thesis. So here he says, another effect of the subnormal family is the cost of maintenance. It may be a mercenary view to take of the problem, yet in view of mounting taxation, it is of importance to the average citizen to know the effect of the subnormal family on his tax bill. So here he's actually just saying it's very expensive to take care of these people. So people need to be aware of this. And he kind of, I'm not going to read the second bit, it's a bit longer, but he goes into detail there and he kind of talks about which organizations kind of shoulder the burden of these, as he calls them, subnormal families. And so here, there's some other interesting bits I'm going to read. So on the left, he says, sterilization of the mentally and physically defective has long been advocated, but only recently has it seeped into the public consciousness. And he goes on a little bit to say, for while it gives protection to society, yet it deprives the defective of nothing except the privilege of bringing into the world children who would only be a care to themselves and a charge to society. And this bit on the right, I think, is very interesting. He says, the objection is raised that sterilization might be abused. This is granted. There are possibilities of abuse in any forward step, but the ethics of the medical profession have always been of a very high order, and we've entrusted to them many duties just as delicate and as capable of misuse. The matter would have to be handled carefully. Only those mentally defective and those incurably diseased should be sterilized. So he says only there, but I want to draw attention to that part because here he's explicitly saying these people should not be taken care of. Whereas in kind of the Hippocratic idea of healthcare, as we may say, these are the most vulnerable people and the people most deserving and needing of treatment. So we should draw attention to them. But he says, no, they're a problem. So this isn't really healthcare. It lessens the inherent dignity of every human being. So in sum, Douglas believed that it would be acceptable to medically sterilize people in order to promote, among other things, the financial well-being of society. And this is really a far cry from the Hippocratic notion of healthcare, where doctors should not cause harm for any reason. Douglas seemed to prioritize equality of access to healthcare, whatever he meant by that, over ensuring that healthcare does what it's supposed to. And this will come into play later with abortion and euthanasia laws in Canada.
All right, so now that we've looked at all of the negative aspects of healthcare, what is the role of doctors, nurses, and other healthcare professionals? This brings us back to the key point in the Hippocratic Oath, do no harm. One must ask, first of all, what is harm? Harm is done to a patient when a medical professional intends to cause harm to a patient to increase an illness, either by treating them with unnecessary or potentially harmful substances, or when essential treatment is intentionally withheld. So the role of a doctor is to heal patients, not to harm them. Medical professionals ought to aid patients to the best of their ability with the intention to have the patient make a full recovery. Now we know that full recovery isn't always possible, such as in the case of a terminal cancer patient. In that case, it is the duty of healthcare professionals to provide all necessary resources to meet the patient's basic needs, such as nutrition and hydration, with minimal discomfort. This includes making the necessary healthcare available to them, healthcare that is ethically produced and administered.
All right, so now that we've kind of gone over that definition in more detail, we're going to look at Canadian history and see how it's been misused. So first of all, abortion. So as I'm sure many of you know, abortion was first legalized in Canada for healthcare purposes, in quotations, because it was illegal until the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1968 and 1969, which passed under Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau. And this law continued to keep abortion criminalized, but with the exception of what were termed therapeutic abortions, which would abortions undertaken in pregnancies that supposedly would endanger the health of the mother. And these had to be approved by a therapeutic abortion committee consisting of 3 doctors. So to a lot of people, this sounds reasonable because they think, well, the doctor's, by committing abortion, he's saving the life of the mother. But that's not really a good way of thinking about it for 2 main reasons. So number one, there is no medical condition in which carrying a pregnancy to term endangers the life of a mother such that murdering her unborn child is necessary. And there's an overwhelming medical consensus on this fact, such as the Dublin Declaration, which was just posted in the chat. That's a document signed by over 1,000 medical practitioners and researchers who confirm this. And so number two, abortion is the ending of a human life, and there's not really any way around this fact. So a physician is not really fulfilling the oath to do no harm, and this is more of a blatant breaking of the oath in the commission of abortion. And so another interesting thing to note about the original law is that it never defined the term health. So it's not unreasonable that you could have doctors allowing abortions that threatened maybe mental health or emotional health or something that wasn't even life-threatening. So this law took effect ultimately based on this false idea of healthcare, in which the only solution is to end somebody's life for a condition that does not exist, that condition being a life-threatening pregnancy that can only be resolved via abortion. So the famous court case that eventually struck down this law, which is R versus Morgan Taylor, it used a similar argument because it argued that making a woman carry a pregnancy to term would violate the woman's right to security of the person under Section 7 of the Charter because of, again, supposed health risks. So overall, abortion was legalized in Canada because of a disregard for basic science and a misunderstanding of what constitutes healthcare, and these reasons are still at play in the abortion discussion today. So a similar thing took place with the legalization of euthanasia and assisted suicide in Canada. So before I get into that, we're gonna look a little bit at the history of the euthanasia laws in Canada. So in 2015, first there was a unanimous Supreme Court decision that allowed physician-assisted suicide for competent consenting adults. But the law that first allowed assisted suicide and euthanasia was with Bill C-14 in 2016. So this bill allowed euthanasia and assisted suicide for mentally competent consenting adults who have a grievous and irremediable medical condition in which their natural death is reasonably foreseeable. So in March of 2021, Bill C-7 expanded this law even further by a few ways. First, it removed the requirement for a natural death to be reasonably foreseeable. And it removed the requirement for 2 witnesses. It only required 1 for a written request. And number 3, it removed the 10-day reflection period required for people whose deaths were reasonably foreseeable. Lastly, the the requirement for final consent from patients was removed for patients who had requested euthanasia previously, but lost the ability to consent later on. So the rationale for both these bills, C-14 and C-7, was one that invoked healthcare, again, similar to the law on abortion. Because it basically said, if people are greatly suffering and they're going to die anyway, why not just cut their suffering short? Why make them die an agonizing, undignified death? And in this case, it seems to be the job of the doctor to prevent suffering. But the role of doctors is to heal, and if healing via treatment is not possible, to provide for the basic needs of a patient with minimal discomfort. So for this reason, it's not really ethical for them to harm or kill a patient for the sake of reducing suffering, especially in cases where a patient would be treatable or in otherwise viable health. Even C-14 recognized euthanasia as a form of harm, considering, as you can see here, it had to amend the definition of homicide under the law to make euthanasia legal. It says, basically it just says nobody's committing homicide if they assist in suicide, if they aid in assisted suicide or euthanasia. That's no longer killing under the law. So this justification of euthanasia, that it's to prevent unnecessary suffering accompanying an inevitable painful death, didn't even hold up with C7's amendments to the law, because what C7 did was, number one, it made euthanasia on the sole basis of mental illness legal 2 years from now. So that's 2023. And actually by some interpretations that is currently allowed under the law. And we can get into this after if anyone's curious about it. But the thing is, mental illnesses themselves do not lead to inevitable death, and treatment is always available. But the current law does not actually require that treatment be attempted before euthanasia or assisted suicide. So really there's a broad category of physically viable people who will, or already, depending on how you interpret the law, qualify for assisted death. So the next thing C7 did was it removed the requirement in C14 that someone's natural death need be reasonably foreseeable for them to qualify for euthanasia. So the legal definition of a reasonably foreseeable death was not even given in the first place, which made this almost useless, but it was still there. But C7 struck that from the law entirely. So the justification that somebody's going to die anyway and they can only suffer in the interim, that's gone because they don't even need to be dying to be euthanized. And number three, as mentioned above, a frightening part of C7 is that if somebody consents to euthanasia and then they lose that ability to consent later on, they can still be euthanized. So this stands in contrast again to the Hippocratic idea of healthcare, where a physician acts in the patient's best interest, because if they can't express their interest here, their life might be taken from them anyway, even if they disagree. So with these bills, what a euthanasia law basically amounts to is a law that sees suffering of some kind, either mental or physical, as grounds to end one's life on, and regardless of someone's actual health. There's no emphasis placed on healing or comforting or anything that would take a suffering person and bring them to health, or at least make their life tolerable. So their health is not really a priority, and they're not being given any semblance of care because they're told that suffering makes their life not worth living. So this can't really be considered healthcare in the proper sense of the term. So to look at some more specific examples of how this false idea of healthcare plays out in abortion and euthanasia, I will pass it off now to Sarah and Sarah Grace.
Thank you, Johnny, for just outlining the basic understanding of what the history is behind euthanasia and abortion in Canada. As Johnny said, I am starting my part with basically what is abortion. So the U.S. National Library of Medicine defines abortion as procedure to terminate a pregnancy. So this definition is used by pro-choice organizations or institutions, including Planned Parenthood, Women's Health Matters, Harvard Health. And if we were to rephrase that definition without the intentional, morally ambiguous terms, it would look something like an abortion is a procedure to terminate the life of an embryo or fetus, thereby terminating a mother's pregnancy. Or to put it just plainly, abortion is the voluntarily killing of a child in utero. And in Canada, we have absolutely no protection for the preborn, meaning that it is currently legal for a mother to obtain an abortion up to the point of birth. So Sarah Grace is just going to drop a link in the chat. I'm going to go through some abortion procedures. And the link in the chat is just to a more detailed explanation if any of you are curious. It does have a little bit of graphic images, just so you're aware of that. So while abortion at any stage of pregnancy kills an innocent child, there are different procedures depending on how far along in the pregnancy the abortion takes place. So in the first trimester, there are two different methods of abortion. One is the abortion pill, in which a woman takes two different pills. One starves the baby of the nutrients it really needs to live. And the second one expels the baby, and it comes out like a heavy period. Another procedure typically performed between 5 and 13 weeks after the first day of the mother's last period is an aspiration abortion, also referred to as a suction D&C abortion. So in a suction D&C abortion, the woman's cervix is dilated, so putting the D in D&C, and the baby is also vacuumed out using a suction catheter inserted into the uterus, which also uses a force that is 10 to 20 times greater than your household vacuum to extract the baby. And then finally, to make sure that no part is left in the mother that could cause an infection, a metal tool called a curette is used to scrape out any remains. So that puts the C in D&C. And then in the second trimester, the abortion procedure is a little different. It still has the dilation of the cervix. So it's called D&E, or dilation evacuation. So again, the cervix is dilated, and then the abortionist uses an instrument, maybe a Sofer clamp and a curette, to basically dismember the baby and extract the parts from the uterus. And they have to actually make sure that all the parts are there. So they arrange it on a table, because if any part is actually left in the uterus, it can cause severe harm to the mother. But this also comes with significant immediate risk of major complications for the mother. And finally, in the third trimester, the abortion is performed as an induction abortion. And in most cases, the babies killed in abortions are viable outside the womb, meaning they would be able to survive if they were born at that point. In these circumstances, the abortionist injects the baby in utero with a substance that causes the baby to go into cardiac arrest, and then induces the mother to deliver her baby as a stillborn. So obviously, abortion is a major concern in our country, and the highly permissive system in Canada and the United States has led to the killing of so many innocent babies based on gender, ethnicity, physical capabilities, or financial status. So babies who are of color, mainly those of Asian and African descent, are usually more likely to be aborted because of their color. Planned Parenthood, which is the largest abortion provider in North America, is a racist organization that targets minority groups who sometimes don't have the means to support themselves and their child. They set up abortion facilities in areas that are predominantly Black, and these communities have very little resources to support their child because of their financial difficulties. Abortion was and still is pushed as a way of dealing with a problem instead of being offered actual help for their children, like food, diapers, and proper medical care. Instead, these women are offered to kill their child. Planned Parenthood makes abortion seem like healthcare and the only option of dealing with their child. Those who claim abortion is healthcare just try to sell the fact that what they're killing is not actually a child, but rather just a clump of cells, which is scientifically wrong. Also, on an interesting note, like Johnny mentioned, Tommy Douglas, who was a eugenist, Planned Parenthood's founder, Margaret Sanger, was also a eugenist. Also, with modern day technology, we can now test for fetal anomalies, including physical and mental disabilities, for example, Down syndrome. And while this is very good because it gives the parents and the mother time to learn and digest this news, it can also cause fear and worry at the hard life their child will have to face. And unfortunately, healthcare professionals often do decide that these children, because they are less than perfect, would be better to kill them. And in the midst of the parents' worry and stress, they push for an abortion to, quote unquote, spare the child's life. The healthcare system has become so skewed and distorted that it no longer actually cares for the most vulnerable. Instead, they claim to have compassion on them. And instead of offering the actual healthcare that they need, our healthcare actually offers to kill them. So we have a short video that highlights the joy that a child brings, even if they are less than what society deems as perfect. As you can see, Elliot had so many severe complications, and his parents did know that he might not live long. And instead of taking away his small chance of life, and however small it was, they still gave him all the necessary medical and emotional support. And even though Elliot may have only lived 99 days, those days were filled with joy and love that he brought to his family, no matter how sick he was. As Joanna mentioned, medical professionals ought to aid patients to the best of their abilities. In this case, recovery was not possible for Elliot. So this duty was fulfilled because they provided all the necessary resources to meet his basic needs. So in addition to abortion targeting children of color and those who have fetal anomalies, abortion has also targeted the sex of the baby. Recently, a new bill was proposed in the House of Commons. Bill C-233 is an act to amend the criminal code, sex-selective abortions. So basically, this bill was proposed by Member of Parliament Kathy Wagenthal, and it sought to ban sex-selective abortions in Canada. A sex-selective abortion is when a woman decides to kill her unborn child because of the gender of the baby. Usually, parents can find out the sex of their child beforehand. And as you see, there are so many gender reveal parties. And unfortunately, in some cases, if the parent doesn't like the gender of their child, whether it be a girl or a boy, they can decide in Canada to just kill the kid because of their gender. So this occurrence, unfortunately, usually happens in the cases of baby girls. And unfortunately, this bill was voted down. The vote count in the end was 248 opposed and 82 in favor. And the bill did highlight one of the many unfortunate problems in our country today. While the movement for equality of women has picked up over the decades and changed so many things, one fact remains glaringly clear. Not all women were taken into account. Sex-selective abortions mainly target unborn baby girls solely because they are girls, and this is an act of discrimination, and unfortunately one that is legal in our country. So our Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, had a couple of things to say after the voting of the bill. He tweeted out, 81 members of the Conservative Party voted in favor of an anti-choice legislation today. It is completely unacceptable that they will not support, protect, or defend a woman's right to choose. Our government has and always will. And I do find this a bit hypocritical of him because it says they will not choose to support, protect, or defend a woman's right to choose, while they are killing all the young women in the womb. He also has a longer quote. I'm just going to focus on one part. We have taken action to protect this right, including repealing outdated sections in the criminal code, investing in groups like Planned Parenthood, and easing restrictions on Plan B to help increase its accessibility. We will always defend women's rights while conservative politicians try to restrict them. He also says women and women alone also have the right to make decisions about their own bodies. And with the continuation of sex-selective abortions, he is taking away the decision of the woman in the womb, and basically giving more money for these children to be killed because of their gender and because they are female. In Canada, a child can be aborted for any reason and for no reason at all. Children who are colored, have fetal anomalies, or our girls are targeted and discriminated against every day. And unfortunately, the children who are the most targeted are female babies of color descent. And our healthcare system, which is in place to provide that help to those who are sick and vulnerable, instead take advantage of them and kill them based on what they look like, what their capabilities are, and what their gender is. Sarah Grace will now help outline how euthanasia and assisted suicide also targets them and our abuse of our healthcare system.
Thanks, Sarah. So the textbook definition of euthanasia is slightly more transparent than the abortion definition. Medical News Today defines both euthanasia and assisted suicide as deliberate action taken with the intention of ending a life in order to relieve consistent suffering. So the distinction between the two is that euthanasia is the act of killing another person, usually through lethal injection. A medical practitioner is the one who directly administers the drug to the patient, whereas assisted suicide is when someone is provided with the means or tools to kill themselves by another person. So legally, this usually means the prescription of a lethal drug to a patient that they administer to themselves. Euthanasia and assisted suicide are often collectively referred to by the term medical assistance in dying, or MAID in Canadian legislation, as Johnny and Joanna mentioned. So the legalization of euthanasia and assisted suicide in Canada sets the precedent that it is okay to kill people under certain conditions. While some view euthanasia as a compassionate response to suffering and state that people should be free to choose to end their lives with dignity, euthanasia is not about freedom or compassion. It is the abandonment of people at their most vulnerable. Under the current legislation, an individual must meet certain criteria in order to be eligible for euthanasia or assisted suicide, as Johnny mentioned. So they must be at least 18 years of age. They have to have a grievous and irremediable medical condition, make a voluntary request for euthanasia or assisted suicide, and give informed consent to the procedure. So the term grievous and irremediable medical condition is open to interpretation by the medical professional. All that is specified is that the practitioner must be of the opinion that the individual has a serious and incurable illness, disease, or disability. The individual must be in an advanced state of irreversible decline in capability, and the illness, disease, or disability, or the individual's state of decline, must cause enduring, intolerable physical or psychological suffering that cannot be relieved under conditions that are acceptable to the patient. That being said, there is no penalty if the medical practitioner's opinion is mistaken, provided that the other conditions are met. This legislation targets individuals who are sick or disabled. Instead of devoting the time, care, and resources to help them to manage or treat their symptoms, it disposes of the patient altogether. It gets rid of them as though they are a problem or a burden. Suddenly, the freedom to choose death becomes the duty to choose death, rather to become an inconvenience to those around them. This was the case for Candace Lewis, who has several medical conditions, including spina bifida, cerebral palsy, and chronic seizure disorder. In 2016, right after euthanasia became legalized, she overheard a doctor telling her mother that it was selfish of her to refuse to consider assisted death as an option for her daughter. Roger Foley, who was suffering from cerebellar ataxia, faced similar pressure from his doctors at a London hospital in 2017, where he was offered the choice to stay at the hospital for $1,500 per day or to accept assisted death. I think it's worth noting that while these cases may seem distant, my grandfather was a patient in the same hospital that attempted to influence Roger Foley to accept assisted death. And while I do not want to villainize the entire hospital for the actions of a few doctors, the fact that healthcare practitioners at the hospital thought that death was the best option for Roger Foley and that it was acceptable to try to convince him to kill himself in his best interest, particularly after he explicitly said that no, he was not interested. It showcases the flaws in this line of thinking and in the healthcare system that considers that this option is compassionate care. So for this reason, Roger Foley launched a lawsuit against the hospital, and this is what his lawyer, Ken Berger, had to say about medical assistance in dying. It's clear as a lawyer that the safeguards are not sufficient to protect Canadians and that something needs to be done. Similarly, ethicist Tom Coach observed that the larger concern is when the issue of the care of the fragile becomes simply a matter of financial expediency. When we are given the option for a rapid death rather than a complex life, we are all at risk. However, despite these issues, not only did the legislation at the time remain unchanged, but new legislation has also recently passed that limits procedural safeguards and increases eligibility even further, as Johnny outlined in his explanation of Bill C-7. While euthanasia or assisted suicide on the sole basis of mental illness is not currently allowed, although, again, as Johnny mentioned, that claim may be disputed considering the use of the term psychological suffering as an indicator of a grievous and irremediable medical condition, it will be made legal in March of 2023. This broadens the discriminatory potential to include those with mental illness and does not take into account that those suffering from mental illness may not be capable of making the best decisions for their own self-interest. That being said, this has not stopped Belgium and the Netherlands from killing those suffering from mental illness alone. Not only that, but in 2014, Belgium also legalized euthanasia for children and minors. There are currently no age restrictions on euthanasia in Belgium, and I read somewhere that actually 8% of infants who die in Belgium are euthanized for disabilities. So they have not consented. Literally, infants are dying because of euthanasia. The same law allows Belgian doctors to suggest euthanasia to terminally ill patients, regardless of whether the patient himself has mentioned it first. As I've already shown, this is happening in Canada, despite the fact that it is currently illegal. At least it's illegal for the time being, but we are in danger of heading down the same slippery slope as Belgium and the Netherlands, where deeds previously thought unthinkable are being considered a human right. These human rights injustices have occurred before. Dr. Leo Alexander, an Austrian-born psychiatrist and an expert consultant to the Nuremberg war crimes trial, pointed out that the Holocaust was made possible through a massive public propaganda campaign that undermined medical ethics. The chronically sick, the mentally or physically disabled were, as he observed, the first victims. It started, he wrote, with the acceptance of the attitude, basic in the euthanasia movement, that there is a such thing as a life not worthy to be lived. Made legislation, whose supposed aim is to allow for freedom and dignity in death, is actually harmful to the very people it claims to support. It confuses the quality of a person's life to mean the value of a person's life. This implies that the value of life is a spectrum dependent on a person's state or circumstances, as opposed to inherent due to their humanity. This false conception is demeaning and leaves the vulnerable open to abuse by the very people meant to protect them. This is not healthcare. Proposing euthanasia as a sort of band-aid treatment to people whose conditions require more care is the opposite of a compassionate response. A person's life is worth more than a band-aid treatment. A person's life is worth the time and money required to get them the compassionate and personal care that they need to live with dignity. Doctors cannot care for or treat people who are dead. If a doctor brings a patient to the point where they are no longer able to provide any sort of care or treatment, for example, through euthanasia or assisted suicide, even for the purpose of relieving their suffering, they are causing harm to that patient, which directly violates their very purpose as medical professionals. We need assistance in living, not assistance in dying.
Next, we will be discussing conscience rights. Even in a culture that pushes for such harmful practices as just discussed by Sarah F. and Sarah Grace, there are doctors out there who wish to abide by the Hippocratic Oath. However, in Canada, there are many challenges for pro-life healthcare providers to protect the sanctity of life, which is the exact job of all physicians. So conscience rights are rights that protect an individual's ability to act according to what they believe is morally best and allows them to refuse to take part in actions that contradict their conscience. Currently in Canada, there is no federal legislation protecting the conscience rights of doctors and healthcare professionals when it comes to abortion and euthanasia, despite freedom of conscience being the first fundamental freedom in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. The only province with protection of conscience rights in our legislation is Manitoba. Here in Ontario, for instance, doctors who do not wish to take part in abortion, euthanasia, or assisted suicide, either directly or indirectly, must refer the patient to another doctor to have the procedure done. Doctors are at risk of losing their jobs or even medical licenses if they choose to protect life. They are put in a position where they must betray their oath. Kelly Block, Conservative MP of Carleton Trail Eagle Creek, introduced Bill C-268, Protection of the Freedom of Conscience Act, on February 18, 2021. This private member's bill proposed to make it a punishable offense to force a medical professional to take part in or refer a patient for euthanasia and assisted suicide, as well as make it a punishable offense to fire or refuse to hire a medical professional based solely on the refusal to participate in euthanasia and assisted suicide. This is extremely important to have protection for our medical professionals so that they don't have to park their pro-life morals and values in order to keep their jobs. The bill had 2 readings since being proposed. However, due to an election being called, the bill is now dead. It will have to be retabled after the election. Something to note is that the Conservatives were criticized for including conscience rights in their platform. As a result, Aaron O'Toole, who in his leadership election vowed to protect the conscience rights of healthcare professionals, recently came out to say they would still require physicians to provide effective referrals, which would do absolutely nothing to protect conscience rights. He told a reporter during a campaign stop, saying, "They will have to refer because the rights to access those services exist across the country." It's disheartening to hear of the leader of the party making a switch on his position, but we can only hope for individuals like Kelly Block to speak up and advocate for the protection of conscience rights in Parliament. So now I am very pleased to introduce our special guest joining us today. Dr. Laura Lewis previously worked as a family physician for 22 years and is now the Executive Director of Pregnancy Care Canada. We are so honored to have her join us and to share her experiences in the medical field, and as well as hear about the work she does in helping men and women faced with crisis pregnancies.
Thank you so much and welcome everyone. It really is my pleasure to be with you today, and thank you for the invitation and for the quality of your presentations. All of you have obviously put in a lot of effort and care so much about this topic. And it really is encouraging to me as someone who would be in the older generation to see people of your age care so much about matters that affect so many in our nation, and to educate us, to help bring change and to bring hope and to open mindsets to one that values all life. As mentioned, my name is Dr. Laura Lewis, and I'm the Executive Director of Pregnancy Care Canada. We're a national Christian organization that helps to establish and equip pregnancy care centers across Canada. And we do this through coaching, resources, and training, whether to a local community interested in starting a pregnancy care center or to the staff and leaders actively involved in the day-to-day care. And currently there are 80 affiliated centers spanning from Vancouver Island to Prince Edward Island. The importance of practical pregnancy care support is an area I care deeply about. For 22 years, I worked as a family physician, and many times I had patients wrestling with an unexpected pregnancy. They were needing support and information that wasn't always available from me or from other services in our community. So I joined with others in our town to help establish a local pregnancy care center so that my patients and others in our region would have access to a safe place to work through their pregnancy decision, a place providing compassionate support, accurate medical information, and practical help. But I haven't always thought this way. For many years, I supported abortion. Early in my time at university, I heard Henry Morgentaler speak. I imagine you are all familiar with who he was. a family doctor instrumental in setting up abortion clinics across Canada. I listened to him and I agreed with him. I didn't think much more about it. I knew many women who had an abortion, and once it was done, we never talked about it. Later, I went on to study medicine, and despite learning about the unique DNA blueprint established at the moment of conception, despite studying embryology and fetal development, learning that the heart begins to beat 3 weeks after fertilization, that at 9 weeks the organs are in place, despite knowing all of that, when it came to abortion, my thinking was very compartmentalized. Abortion was something that helped a woman deal with her situation, and the scientific truth about fetal development was in another compartment. I practiced medicine like that for over a decade. If a woman requested an abortion, I didn't ask a lot of questions and assumed she had fully considered her decision. And afterwards, other than in the immediate post-procedure phase, I didn't inquire about the impact of the abortion. Over time, however, my viewpoint changed. About 10 years into my practice, I became a Christian, and I began to think more deeply about many matters. And yet I still didn't have a revelation about life and the importance of honoring and valuing all life. Then one day, I remember watching a young girl with Down syndrome and observing how her parents responded to her, how they made room for her uniqueness, how they loved her. And I began to feel uncomfortable about prenatal testing. Who were we, the medical community, to decide that someone's life didn't matter? And that began unraveling the way I had separated abortion and general medical care. The more I questioned it, the more I realized the error of my own thinking, the inadequacy of the questions I asked my patients considering abortion, and the importance of ensuring that in a culture that championed choice in this area, that women needed access to alternatives to abortion to truly have a choice. And the more involved I became in the work of our local pregnancy care center, the more women started telling me their abortion stories. And those stories were hard to hear. Regardless of a person's worldview or opinion regarding abortion, the reality is that there are many women and men who regret their abortion decision and who are dealing with the aftermath of it, not knowing how to process their pain, not knowing what to do with their grief. They are forced to hold it in and cover it up. And so that's part of what I would like to convey to you today. At times, a bold and clear argument regarding the facts and raw truth of abortion may be required and effective. But I also believe that the longer we journey in an abortion on demand culture, the more we need to be mindful of our words. There are thousands of hurting women and men living with post-abortion grief. Statistics indicate 1 in 3 women will have had an abortion by the time they're 45. So we must think about how we're communicating to help bring change, open hearts, and shift opinions and attitudes. How can we change the narrative that says abortion is good always without restriction or any other consideration? It's a narrative that often silences or diminishes voices of regret. 1 Corinthians 13 says, "If I speak in the tongues of men or of angels, but do not have love, I am only a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal." And Proverbs 25:11, "A word fitly spoken is like apples of gold in settings of silver." Let us ask ourselves, when we speak about abortion, do we sound like that clanging cymbal? What if we were to intentionally speak compassionate words that are fitly spoken with love, mercy, and truth as modeled by Jesus? I believe this is how we will usher in change and help to heal the hurting in our nation. May we, and especially you as the next generation, build bridges of understanding rather than walls of separation with others who may be working in this area or even with those who completely disagree with us. It is possible to have respectful discussions without betraying our values and beliefs. And finally, how we listen and the questions we ask can greatly impact the woman experiencing an unexpected pregnancy. With this in mind, Pregnancy Care Canada has put together 2 short booklets, one specifically developed to help medical professionals. It includes some key questions for patients to help them make a well-informed pregnancy decision without any underlying uncertainty, and another for family and friends wanting to help in this area. A digital copy of the booklets is available on our website, and I believe the link will be put in the chat. Also visit the blog section on our website for other information and articles that might be of interest to you. Thank you for caring about all lives, and in particular for the vulnerable and those impacted by an unexpected pregnancy. Thank you.
Dr. Lewis, thank you so much for sharing your story with us. You have an extremely powerful message, and we're so lucky to have you speak with us, so thank you. As Joanna and Johnny laid out for us by dissecting the Hippocratic Oath, the role of healthcare providers is to do no harm. As mentioned earlier, there are no circumstances in which harm is permissible. However, as it has been revealed, the origins of our healthcare system in Canada has ties to eugenics. Already beginning on a slippery slope, we see healthcare in Canada decline as we look at practices such as abortion, euthanasia, and assisted suicide that deliberately end life but get passed off as healthcare. And as Sarah and Sarah discussed, these practices are used to target the most vulnerable groups within our population. These are groups that are dependent and most in need of the resources our healthcare system offers. However, our healthcare system views these groups as an inconvenience, eliminating the person and not the problem. So, what should our healthcare system look like? Simply put, it shall do no harm. We've unpacked the darkness of our healthcare system here in Canada. Although disheartening, it is important to look forward with hope and push for the change we wish to see. What should we be striving for? Personally, we believe it is important to have a healthcare system based on compassion. This means healthcare professionals that properly inform women and care for the most vulnerable, such as the terminally ill and the elderly. We would like to see doctors caring for those with fetal anomalies as opposed to viewing them as abnormal and unworthy of life. We would like to see a healthcare system that does not deem who should live and who should not, but rather uses its resources to fully protect the sanctity of all human life. And with this, we would like to see laws that protect the ability for healthcare providers to do their jobs and to do no harm. Suffering is inevitable. We all suffer to some capacity. We may feel a responsibility to relieve the suffering of others. However, in Canada, through abortion and euthanasia, we relieve suffering by ending someone's life rather than trying our best to improve the quality of the person's life. This is not real healthcare. This is the exact opposite. We can't neglect to acknowledge the pain in situations where abortion and euthanasia are thought to be needed. As Dr. Lewis encounters, there are many reasons as to why a woman may consider an abortion. Having a child in ideal circumstances is not easy, let alone having a child in difficult circumstances. The solution pushed forward in our society is abortion. But as Dr. Lewis points out, men and women in crisis pregnancies deserve real solutions, and this comes from support and resources. And crisis pregnancy centers offer exactly this. They provide baby clothes, maternal clothes, baby supplies such as food, diapers, car seats. They provide counseling, they fundraise for women, and so much more. So please check out Pregnancy Care Canada and Choice for Two, which is a database where you can input your address and see the crisis pregnancy centers in your area. Joanna left them in the chat, so please do check those out. And if you know someone considering an abortion or anyone that is post-abortive, please refer them to these resources. Because as Dr. Laura Lewis points out, many men and women are hurting. And in regards to euthanasia and assisted suicide, it is undeniable the suffering and the need for support that occurs at the end of someone's life. But again, the solution our healthcare system offers is to kill these individuals out of convenience. What about real solutions? Our healthcare system should be placing greater importance to palliative care and resources to the terminally ill and those at the end of their lives. Furthermore, we need better access to mental health services to help those considering euthanasia and assisted suicide. We need to be targeting the problem and not the person. If you know someone considering euthanasia or assisted suicide, please refer them to the Euthanasia Prevention Coalition, as well as Compassionate Community Care. Those links will be in the chat. And both of these resources help individuals discuss end-of-life concerns and needs. In our presentation today, we are mainly discussing the elements of the healthcare system. However, even as individuals, we play a role too. In wanting to relieve someone's suffering, we can do this through lending a helping hand. Rather than encouraging someone to take the life of their unborn child, we can encourage them that they are capable of having a baby and reaffirming that they have our support. Other ways to take action are by donating to crisis pregnancy centers or volunteering your time. Furthermore, Dr. Lewis reiterated that it is extremely important that we approach the topic of abortion with compassion. And in helping the elderly and terminally ill, we should be taking the extra time to care for these people, whether it's calling your grandparents more often, volunteering at a long-term care home, or simply even smiling and talking to elderly individuals you encounter, or anyone for that matter. Acts of kindness can make someone